If you remember, our course guiding question asks you to link the concept of agency to the idea of reading symbolically. In other words, we're going to be asking ourselves, how do authors use symbolic language to comment on human agency? Obviously, we've already kind of laid the foundation on human agency. Now we need to talk about reading symbolically. And simply stated, what we mean by reading symbolically is reading beyond the literal meaning of words, reading beyond things like character and plot and literal description, and trying to get what literary scholars call connotations: psychological, emotional, cultural, intertextual, which means between texts, and intratextual, which means inside the text, associations produced by language. So when authors use words, they communicate symbolic meanings. And those symbolic meanings can be psychological, emotional, cultural, between texts, within the text. They operate on many levels beyond literally what's happening. We're going to, in this unit of the class, learn about 5 terms or literary devices that are going to help us explore interpretive pathways. They're going to create ways for us to read symbolic meaning. And when we do that, our question is not going to be, is something a metaphor, or is something a metonym, or is something ironic, or is something an illusion, or is something an image? Our question is going to really be about how those ideas can help us interpret symbolic meanings. So we're going to ask questions more like, does reading this word or passage as a metaphor help us explain the symbolic meanings of the language? Does reading this passage or image or text as a metonym help us explain the symbolic meanings of the language? Or, even if it's not language, a visual representation, a piece of art, a film, movie, TV show, etc. So what we're looking at here are not boxes, labels, static identities. We're looking at interpretive pathways and possibilities. So the question is never, is this a metaphor? The question is, does reading it as a metaphor help us explain its symbolic meaning? Does reading it as a metonym help us explain its symbolic meaning, etc.? That's the core move that we're going to want to work on. And to be able to make that move, we have to spend some time studying these terms and studying the basic principles of symbolic analysis. And that's what the lecture that follows this video is all about. Let's look at an example using this image of me wearing a Cookie Monster Great Wave t-shirt. And the written lecture goes in much more detail about the cultural allusions being made here to Sesame Street and Japanese printmaking art. And that's something you can explore in interesting ways. But for right now, let's just sort of look at this image and ask ourselves the question, how would reading this as a metaphor help us understand its symbolic meaning? Well, what metaphor means is symbolism through comparison. A metaphor is very simply a symbolic comparison, something that compares one thing to another in a way that creates connotations, psychological, cultural, intertextual meanings. So when we look at the Cookie Monster, we can compare the Cookie Monster to Jim. And the Cookie Monster can give us insight into Jim. So if we say the Cookie Monster represents Jim's love of symbolic analysis, then we can see that the comparison works like this. In the same way that the Cookie Monster devours cookies, Jim devours language. Like the Cookie Monster's love of cookies, Jim's love of symbolic language fuels him, nourishes him, helps him thrive. Do you see how the language of metaphor there, comparing Jim and the Cookie Monster and their rapacious desires to cookies and symbolic language, allows us to get at a richer understanding of the symbolic meaning of the image? So again, here the question is not, is this a metaphor? The question is, does reading it, interpreting it as a metaphor, help us unpack the symbolic meaning of the image? Let's try the same thing, though, with the same image, but talk about it as a metonym. A metonym is symbolism through substitution, representation, or association. In other words, most symbolism is metonymic, is a form of metonism. In fact, the only symbolism that really isn't a metonym is something that's symbolic through comparison. Because what? Something that's symbolic through comparison is a metaphor. But the very point of all this is to point out that something isn't a metaphor or a metonym. It can just as easily be both. And the Cookie Monster is a perfect example of this. Because we talked about how the Cookie Monster is a metaphor, how we can compare Jim and the Cookie Monster and come with a better understanding of the symbolic meanings. But we can also think of the Cookie Monster as a metonym for Jim, as a symbolic substitute for Jim, as a representation of Jim, as something we associate with Jim. Why can we do that? Because here's Jim wearing the Cookie Monster on his shirt. So the Cookie Monster reminds us of him. It symbolically substitutes for him. It's a representation of him. We associate the Cookie Monster with him because we've seen him wearing this t-shirt. We've heard him talking about the Cookie Monster in class. So the Cookie Monster can be read as a metonym for Jim, a symbolic substitute, representation, or association, but it can also be read as a metaphor, something we can compare to Jim and his love of symbolic language. In other words, the more layers to our symbolic reading, the richer. If we read it as a metaphor, great. But if we also read it as a metonym, that's even greater. There's even more to unpack and explore. So what the lecture you're about to read is going to do is show you how we can do the same thing we just did here in this video with every term. Whether it's metaphor, metonym, irony, imagery, or illusion, there is a very clear process and approach by which you can break down the symbolic meanings of these interpretive pathways. And that's your goal as you read this material. Learn how to use these interpretive pathways to more richly interpret symbolic language.